Okay, it's noon. Hi, everyone. I know there are still some people who are probably going to trickle in, but I wanted to just say hello, introduce everyone. I'm Lizzie Hoffman, the marketing manager here at TowerData. It's great to see everyone. And today we're going to talk about ways that you can uncover additional revenue in your email database. Today we have Brian Cardona and Matt Wallace with us. Brian's the president of TowerData, Matt's VP of sales. I'd love for you both to give yourselves a quick intro. That would be great.
Okay, great. Hey, everyone, this is Brian. Thanks for joining us today. We're excited to get to talk to you about your email databases and how we can help you in 2021. Just a little bit about me. I've been here working at TowerData for over 15 years now. I'm losing track of the numbers, but yeah, we've been helping folks with their email data marketing and validation and identity and so on for many years. So happy to share with you some of that experience and give you some ideas to get the year off to a great start.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matt. As Lizzie mentioned, I am the VP of Sales over here. I've been with TowerData a little bit over 2 years. Before that, I was with Xverify for about 4 years. We were acquired by TowerData about 2 years ago. And as Brian mentioned, we help our clients both with data validation and now with TowerData's offerings, also data append and enrichment. So coming from a strictly validation background, now moving over to TowerData, where we also have the ability to append and enrich clients' data, it has made personally my conversations a lot more enriching and rewarding with our customers. So very happy with the transition and very excited and pleased with the products and results that we've been able to bring to our prior Xverify customers that are now transitioning to the TowerData platform.
So you guys have all this experience, and I'm super excited to jump into everything today. Just a quick note for everyone, no need to jot anything down or feel like you need to take really detailed notes. We're going to follow up with a video recording of this that'll be in your inboxes, and there are available to whichever side you have your panel on, there are handouts available for you that cover validation and some of the other topics that we're going to talk about. I'll reference those throughout the discussion, but just sit back, relax, do whatever you need to do, hang out, and if you don't catch something, no worries, it'll be there for you later. But to start out with, we often talk about validation, verification, hygiene, and I know I'm not the only person who it took a little bit of learning to understand the differences between them, because there are, in fact, differences. So I would love if you guys could make sure that we have our definitions in order as far as validation, verification, and hygiene.
Yeah, thanks, Lizzie. So, when we talk about additional revenue in your database, one of the most important things is the quality of the data in there. And as Lizzie mentioned, I'm sure many of you are familiar with an email validation service. And TowerData has been offering that for a very long time. The market's changed a lot since we started offering it in around 2002. And different words have come in, or different kind of practices or approaches to using this service. So as Lizzie mentioned, validation, verification, and hygiene, kind of the three words you hear thrown around. And as the market's matured, they so have those services. And I think the definitions have come to a point where, as an industry, we can maybe align with respect to what those mean. So to go first with validation, which is what TowerData calls our service, that encompasses a lot of different things, but more specifically, or strictly speaking, validation. When we talk about that, we're talking about three main things. So the syntax of the email address, right? So is there an @ sign and a top-level domain? Are there any weird characters or spaces? And we're complying with the RFCs that are published with respect to email there. So the syntax of the email, does that look good? And then secondarily, the domain. So does the domain exist? Does it have a mail server? And then finally, the mailbox check. So validation would be really a technical look at that email address. Is it deliverable? In using SMTP tools to attempt to determine whether it is or isn't. So with that, we also have verification and hygiene. And Matt, you want to take us through those?
Sure. Thanks, Brian. And verification would be typically our second step in the process. As Brian mentioned, SMTP would be kind of the first pass we take on an email. But when we do an SMTP transaction with the mail server, we don't always get a conclusive response, or that conclusive response isn't necessarily set in stone, and there's other steps that we would want to take to ensure the kind of final status of the email. And the second step we would take would fall under that verification umbrella. So during this process, we are going to look at historical data from emails being sent to that email address. We're going to be looking at transactional data tied to that email address. We're going to be looking at email open data, bounce data, and other activity data around that email to better quantify if the response the server gave us is indeed correct. One thing Brian alluded to is having, been in this business for, 20 years now, since '02, we have a really trove of historical data, which I think gives us such a unique advantage in the space in terms of how servers communicate and how we interpret the response over the years. And a lot of that data falls into our second step, which is the verification process, which helps, us as a provider bring our customers, a little bit more concrete and granular results on that email address. And after that verification process is complete, we'll take that through our third step, which we would define as our hygiene process. And hygiene is a term that I think is a little bit more universally accepted as kind of a non-SMTP check across the industry. And we would define hygiene as most other providers would. I think there's some consensus in the space around hygiene in terms of, is that email a potential spam trap? Is it a known complainer? Is it tied to a spam litigator? Or just in general, does it pose a higher risk to mail to? So, we've compiled this data over the course of 2 decades through dozens of different partners in the data space and the email space that really gives our customers a complete solution. So when email goes through all these 3 steps, we're pretty confident in terms of what the final resolution is on that email. So it's not just a single process or 2 processes. It's really kind of a waterfall process. We take that email through to get a very defined final result.
Awesome. So those are super helpful. I appreciate it. And it's going to help us all stay on the same page as we go through this talk. That said, if there are any questions that anyone has at any point in time, feel free to leave them in the questions section of the panel, the module, and we can go through and answer them at the end. If that's not something you want answered right now, feel free to reach out to us and we'll have that information at the end too. But if you are curious about any of the definitions or anything we just talked about, again, I want to reference those handouts that are available for you too. So there's lots of pieces here that you can kind of latch on to if you have any questions. But moving on.
Lizzie, let me add too, so it is a lot, right? And you're going to see different things in the marketplace. I think one good approach is, call us or whoever you're working with and ask them about those things. I think the key thing as you look at your database, right, is this multifaceted approach. You might only need hygiene if you're mailing to your data all the time and it's deliverable, or you might really need SMTP because the data's been sitting on the shelf for so long. So we're going to get into that. I don't want to jump ahead too far, right, operationalizing it, but call us or whoever you're working with, an expert, and talk to them about what specifically the challenges are that you're facing, and then they can either give you the full plate of services or help you cherry pick which are most appropriate.
Yeah. No,
and Brian, could you speak to Brian, could you obviously have a little bit more experience, speak to the number of different response codes we bring back and maybe how customers can use those granular status codes to build out, better segments, and how maybe some of those statuses could influence how often you want to mail folks?
Yeah, sure. So granularity of results, I think, is an important piece. and giving you again the insights into that database to understand, is it valid, is it not valid, or is it in that gray space? Which, for those of you that are experienced with these services, know that there is a bit of gray space at times. And so, eyes open approach we think is the best way to do it, and be very specific with those results.
And all of those codes that you mentioned, Matt, too, we have a number of places that those are available. So they're in our docs. We have separate site pages for them. So if you have any questions about those, feel free to reach out to us and we can provide those for you. And I know we do some testing along those too, and those show up in the tests, correct? Yeah. So moving on, Brian already spoke a little bit about it, but implementation. So we're talking B2B, B2C. They seem like they don't cross over too much, but in some ways they do. Are there any common difficulties that either or face, B2B, B2C? What are some of the common difficulties they face, and how is validation a solution, or hygiene a solution?
Yeah. So, I think the difficulties are similar. When you're looking at your database, again, let's say you're charged with, hey, marketing manager or product owner, we have this database and we need to drive more revenue from it. I think a couple things. First is capturing new data within that email program and applying a service there. So real-time web form capture is the first most common application of this service, right? So you have your web page, and your web page then calls a validation service in real time through an API to make sure that the email address that you're capturing on that web form is valid. Two main things there. One, you're spending a lot of money, very likely, to drive traffic to your website, right? Maybe it's AdWords or Facebook, or maybe even branding or broadcast advertising with television. Folks get to your website, you have an opportunity to capture accurate data. Let's make sure you are best positioned to do so. We analyzed our API traffic a bit ago in the aggregate and found that about 8% of the email addresses entered on to our API were invalid. So the ROI comes quick. So the first piece operationally would be, as you capture new data, use a real-time web form to make sure that the data you're capturing is accurate and deliverable. Secondarily would be more of a batch processing. Matt, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Thanks, Brian. So batch processing, I always feel, is really the first step that clients want to look at when they're either migrating data management platforms, CRM platforms, or to a new email service provider, or if someone is new into a role as an email marketing manager. I think a batch cleanup of the existing database is really good, because what it does is really uncovers the true, what I would refer to as the potential of your database. So all because there may be 1 million records in there doesn't mean that all of a sudden there's 1 million records worth of revenue, because if you're managing email for a company and whoever you're rolling up to, chances are that person knows kind of the lifetime value of an email address and is going to use that as kind of a benchmark for your performance. So doing a batch validation and maybe uncovering that, hey, 15, 20, 30% of this data is invalid, we have to kind of reset our expectations of how much revenue is in here, I think is a really good first step to take whenever you're kind of looking at a data set, new to a data set, or that data set's being transitioned within a platform. And clients will often pose the question to us, well, how often should we be redoing that? Is that something that should be part of our kind of data quality process? And each customer has to kind of make their own decision. So we feel the best approach is to educate folks about their data. So as a general rule, about 15 to 18% of consumer emails will go bad each year. Folks will stop using those emails. Maybe they're using Verizon.net, a paid internet service provider email that they will no longer use. And about 25 to 30% of B2B emails will turn over each year. So, the average person is at a job just under 4 years. So those numbers on the business side kind of align with kind of industry turnover. So with those numbers in mind, you break that out by quarter, you can have anywhere from 6 to 10% of your data going bad each quarter. So being mindful of that, I think, is important. If what Brian was kind of alluding to earlier, if you're mailing to records on an ongoing basis and having at least one email out every 30 or 60 days, you may get a very low bounce rate from those just turning over, and you'll have a kind of organic process of weeding them out. But if you go 4 or 5 months without engaging in email, we have some clients that will actually put a last mail to date on a record within their CRM or data management platform, and then use that as a guide to say, okay, when this record hits, a certain time frame, we're going to go send it for validation. And beyond just validation, just kind of managing your database in terms of, how those records are aging and what segments they're falling into. And just to touch on mm-hmm.
Sorry to interrupt in too. Just to jump in on that. So deliverability, right? So that's what we're coming back to. So we talked about the web forum and saying, hey, let's make sure we capture good data because data is valuable. But then the second piece is the deliverability component, and as Matt's referring to, mailing to that undeliverable data is going to have a negative impact on that deliverability algorithm, or Gmail or Google or Verizon Media, what their perception of you is, your IP address reputation, but data quality is a big piece of that. So this batch processing is going to address that. As Matt said, if you're mailing on a regular, your batch processing could just be on, newly captured data that maybe your tech team is saying, hey, I can't do a web form. The API stuff is way too much work. Let's instead capture that data and post a nightly file to the API. And then when we go for our welcome message, first touch, we're in good shape. But then, the other cases would be, hey, that data's on the shelf. Let's re-engage to it, as Matt said, or that initial health check is maybe you're migrating from one CRM provider to another, or maybe you're just a new person on the job and you're saying, hey, I don't know what I have in my hands here. Let's get this cleaned up first. So deliverability is, I think, what you want to keep in mind there. Again, how your mail is being treated by those big mailbox providers.
Sure. And Brian, I think to touch on the importance of the API is, it's such an important second step to kind of validate and enforce what you're doing with batch processing. So if you're going to undertake the job of validating your whole database initially and getting current status on those, to not have, to your point, either an ongoing batch process or an API process, you're just going to accelerate that data deteriorating. The analogy I make is that, hey, you spent all Saturday, cleaning your house. You don't all of a sudden want everyone coming in and walking around, with their shoes on. So the API essentially is prompting people to take their dirty shoes off at the door, leave them there. So all the work you just did to get your house or your database current is not accelerated with bad data getting into the database. And I think deliverability and engagement, as you mentioned, is really kind of an important component, because maybe 5-6 years ago when we would have this conversation, the focus was just on, hey, remove the bounces. But now, Google and Yahoo and Oath, all these other platforms, they're really looking for engagement. And Gmail looks at their customers as their customers, right? So when they're in their Gmail, they don't want them bombarded with emails that they're not clicking or opening. That's, to Gmail, taking away from that user's experience. And I think that's kind of an important point of view to point out, because it's not that they didn't sign up for your email or you don't have the right to email them. Gmail's looking at it as they're in our platform and environment, so I need to protect that. So I think that a lot of what we're doing, especially on the hygiene side, is going to help protect your engagement rates, which should really be more of a focus than necessarily just the bounce rates when you look at your overall performance.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I think Yeah, go ahead, Lizzie. I think if we get to the re-engagement campaigns and just like, okay, so now we know we need clean data, right? Like,
Exactly.
and we know how to do that, but now how do we get more money out of that database, right? Like, what are some of the things we can do?
Yeah, exactly. And how are validation and hygiene such important components of a re-engagement campaign, because you want to re-engage obviously all these contacts who maybe haven't opened up an email or participated in any of or partaken in any of your content over the past year or so, and you're sending out this email and you're like, wow, my deliverability has gone way downhill. Where do I go from
Right.
here? How do I solve this? Because that's the last thing you want to happen.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so there's a lot of, I think if you, again, Google or talk to a deliverability consultant, they're going to say, as Matt alluded to, oh man, my Google or my Gmail inbox placement doesn't look too good. My open rates are down. What should I do? And their most common advice would be, hey, shelve your inactives, right? You got to put those inactives on the shelf. Don't mail to them. If they haven't been opening your email in the past 6 months or past year, or maybe even past 90 days, put them on the shelf. And let's just work with those active folks to get your reputation back up. And that seems like an effective strategy, but it could also be considered maybe just short-sighted, right? How do we now get back to, I have all this data on the shelf and I have to meet revenue objectives with this data, right? Like we've got to drive business. These folks are interested in your service. Maybe they bought before or your products. It's organic data. It's very valuable data. So how do we get back into that data? And Matt, I think, has a ton of experience with helping clients re-engage that data. So I'll kick it back to you, Matt, in terms of some good strategies to get that data back in play.
Sure. Thanks, Brian. And really, regardless of your industry, we have a pretty similar blueprint that we lay out to all our customers to take them kind of through a step-by-step process to help them really uncover that revenue that's within their database. So I think re-engagement campaigns are viewed as a bit risky for really two reasons. Number one, as we alluded to, we don't know who might still be active on the email address that we have. Is that person's primary email? Is that their second or third email at this point in time? And the second component is we may not know enough about that customer. How do we re-engage them? Did they stop engaging because we were mailing them offers or content maybe wasn't specific enough to them? So those two components we're going to bring together and create kind of a roadmap on how to safely re-engage emails that are within your database from either former customers or prospects who have clicked and engaged at one point in time. So the first component is, how do we identify whose emails are still active? And one of the unique solutions that TowerData has outside of validation, which is very specific to re-engagement, is our email opener data. So we receive about 50 million unique email open signals on a monthly basis from our network of email publishers for US consumer emails. And over the course of the year, we have about 200 million emails with known open activity that we index from, that we give our clients the opportunity to match their data to. And if you think about it, if there's about 150 million US adults and the average person has about 2 to 3 emails, that's pretty sizable coverage of the US consumer emails that we have activity data on. And so what clients will do is they'll say, hey, I have 1 million emails. These are former customers or prospects that we haven't mailed in a while. They would be able to upload those to our platform. We would be able to typically flag about 30 or 40% of those users and say, hey, here are the most active openers and clickers. Let's start with this group. And that way you have a confirmed open and activity that, hey, this person's email is still primary and they're still active on it. So this process is a couple steps ahead of validation, is really focused on finding those actives in the inactive records. And then the second component is addressing, do we know enough about our customers, right? So if you ask yourself the question, do we know what they purchased before? Do we know the age group, gender, location of our customers? Do we know what those customers look like and what messages we should be putting in front of them in the specific segments? Great, build those out. If you don't, because that data admittedly is pretty hard to collect, right? You're trying to get them to purchase. You don't want to start prompting them questions saying, hey, tell me about this, tell me about that. So our email intelligence tool would allow customers to upload those opener matches, those emails, and we can pretty much append almost any data point that you would need to market to them better. So if you need that data to create more targeted segments based on those high-level demographics or data points, we can provide that second part of the equation. And now that you have a manageable number of emails, where in this case, let's say you had 400,000 known openers compared to 1 million, then you can start building out anywhere from a 4 to 6 email cadence to these folks over a couple weeks, and giving them an incentive to re-engage, right? And understanding that they haven't heard from you in a while, they're very likely to open, but you want to be conscientious about warming up that process, not trying to go for a sale on the first or second email. Mention to them, hey, we haven't heard from you in a while. You know, here's an incentive to take a look at our site, whether it's free shipping, a discount code, or something that would say, okay, I'm going to take the time to take a look and try to get them back re-engaged. And then as you're tracking the metrics of the performance within your ESP, as those folks open and click, then you would be able to migrate them to your more active cadences based on the open signals. And we're typically seeing about a 3 to 4 times increase in email open rates targeting known openers. So it's a real nice, easy, safe way to immediately generate revenue, where, you know, literally for fractions of a penny to find the active records in your database, compared to maybe $1, $2, $3 to go out and acquire a new email. It's very efficient and very quick and very cost effective to help us find your active records and get some intelligent cadences out to them, rather than going through the process of, you know, acquiring emails at a significantly higher cost and a significantly longer acquisition cycle.
Yeah, so that, I mean, I think there's a lot there. You know, I think the main thing is, right, when you're going to re-engage, you know, be smart about it. Make sure you're mitigating the risk of sending to additional inactive data. A couple other ideas, again, around the theme of additional revenue within that email database. Multi-channel is another great thing to consider. If you're not already using direct mail to complement your email list, we think it's a great thing to consider. You know, so take all those email or the postal addresses that you have. Of course, you're going to want to NCOA those and work with your letter shop. And if there's records for which you don't have a postal address, we can help you with that too. And the other piece is display, right? So Facebook custom audiences, maybe take that email list, load it into Facebook. If you're not already doing that, you can target directly to those folks and touch them in another place, right? So you're hitting them on Facebook, you're hitting them with direct mail, you're hitting them with email, and we think all of that is going to really drive additional revenue, you know, in a combined approach.
And Brian, you touching on direct mail is funny, because it seems like that's something that, as email has become more prominent over the past 6 or 7 years, hasn't been as much as a focus. But, you know, one thing that I always bring up to my customers that do it, and the customers that do it seem to do pretty well, is that, you know, when you consider the average person between their business and personal email gets between 75 and 125 emails a day, that space from a personal standpoint and a business space is very crowded. And I'm not sure if you check your mailbox often, but, you know, there's not a lot in there. So you're not going to get lost in the shuffle. And I know a lot of big brands like Brooks Brothers. They do a lot of catalog mailing. They send like a really nice bounded catalog or a really nice kind of postcard with a certain, you know, discount code. So there's a lot of really strong brands that I think use that as part of their branding. And I don't know about you, but whenever my wife gets a nice catalog or a mailer, it seems to just hang around the house for 5 or 6 days. Where in an email, it just hangs around for 30 seconds and goes and gets deleted. So there's that subtle kind of brand building that I think's there, and I think direct mail for especially luxury brands, I think could be very, very, very helpful to supplement direct mail. And there's just not a lot of competition in your mailbox, your postal mailbox, as there is the inbox.
Yep, I agree.
It's like you were reading my mind because I was definitely going to ask about direct mail and its role in all of this, honestly.
Nice.
But if
Yeah,
you two
and we
don't
can
mind,
append name and yeah, and just one quick point, and we do have the ability to append a name and full postal to email records. So that's certainly something that's right in our wheelhouse. So like Brian was saying, to create an additional channel, that's a service that we do offer.
No, for sure. I was gonna say real quick, I just want to be conscious of everyone's time. It's 12:30, but we do have a couple questions that came through. So if you have like 5 minutes or so, Brian and Matt, love to run through a couple of them. If your question doesn't get answered in this little chat that we have right now, we can follow up with you individually. So no worries there if you have to run. But the first one that came in, the first part of it was already answered. So good job, you guys, already answering questions. But the second part of it was, how often would you say a new sign up or registration gets directed to someone's spam folder if it's the first time the inbox is receiving an email from them, from that new source?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, so it's just going to depend on the reputation of your IP address and who you're mailing with, right? Are you on a reputable CRM platform? Talk to them about what their kind of tools are, what visibility they can give you to inbox placement, or consider using a third party to monitor those things. And on a percentage basis, I think I would just be using my experience as a as a consumer, not data that we aggregate, but I would say maybe conservatively single digits, less than 10%. But it's a tough one. I mean, if you're a new company, a startup, and you load your file into MailChimp and and off you go with that data, you could get a little bit of junk mail folder placement. On the other hand, if you're a reputable brand that's really been actively managing that database and you have great engagement, it should go right to the inbox.
Yeah, one thing I would touch on, there are certain industries that the spam folder is a lot more sensitive to. So if you're in finance, auto, anything to do with money or the words free, like Brian mentioned, I think there's a lot of resources out there, software consultants that would kind of help with that initial process. But if you're in certain industries, a lot of those buzzwords will just kick off the filters a lot more than others. So it's probably mindful, depending on your industry, to kind of consider that, as well.
Yeah, good point, man.
Helpful. I love that you guys have such good answers for this. Another question that came through was, from your experience, are there any issues, or there are issues, using third-party web intent data for email acquisition? How big of a problem does validation, verification, and hygiene, how do they play a role in this, verification, hygiene, and validation? And how can one overcome this when working with a data vendor who is doing the deployment?
Can you read the first part of the question again, Lucy? Or you got it, Matt?
Second part of the question.
Second part I got. The first part
Yeah, so most of the time right now with Google, with the cookie still being alive, and well, most web intent data is tied to cookie. Those cookies are tied to emails. So for the most part, those emails are active, and an additional validation certainly will help clean that up, because you are dealing with third-party data. So anytime we're dealing with third-party data, we definitely want to be mindful of taking any additional steps, regardless of what that intent provider may be telling you. At the end of the day, if it's third-party data, you want to take an additional step and run that through validation. But the baseline core of that data should be pretty active because the emails and cookies are tied together.
Do you have anything to add, Brian?
I think that's good. So yeah, web data. I mean, I think that the other piece would just be go slowly, right? You know, find the active data, use those tools to, you know, categorize the data as, you know, the best data, you know, or better data, and then good data, or maybe some of it's bad, and you know, and take it slow and ramp up with those IP addresses and monitor response and you know, pile on. And when you find segments that are working well, you know, repeat. Let's go get those tools, apply them again, and expand from there.
No, definitely. I think there's something said for slow and steady wins the race in that instance.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and strategically, if clients are bringing on that third-party data, like Brian said, I think it's important to bring it on slowly, but also where you bring it on, you wouldn't want to necessarily set up, you know, new IPs or a new sending platform for that new data. If you have a core list that you're sending to that's engaged and you have the deliverability, you know, we've had clients who had success who try to kind of gradually seed those records in just to kind of mitigate the risk across the board, but being mindful of what the performance is of that data. And then as soon as that may not align with your core mailing to start to pull that out. So I think it'd work. You just want to keep a close eye on it and make sure it's relevant too, right? I mean, make sure what you're mailing them is relevant. And I think when you're dealing with third-party data, it's important to look at how we approaching them, right? Like, did they just come to the site and leave and that's all we know about them, right? Like, so we may want to look at things like demographic, append, age, gender to layer more customization in the messaging going out to them rather than, hey, they just came to our site and left in most cases. So there's certain ways to kind of mitigate that and have it feel like a warmer engagement for the folks that you are reaching out to. Because I think consumers are used to that, right? Like when we leave Amazon, right, and we look at a product and we leave, we get 10 emails about that product. So I think we're conditioned to it, but we're conditioned to it by strong brands and relevant content. So I think if you can layer on that data, it's going to give you the opportunity just to be more successful.
I would agree. Well, I think that's all we have time for today, guys. But again, if your question didn't get answered, we'll follow up with you individually. And if you want to reach out to us about anything we talked about, anything we didn't talk about, you can always go to the website, go to chat, just ask for Brian or Matt, because they're just two members of the team who know a lot about this, and anyone can pretty much help you from our team. But just go to the chat, ask for them, or there's resources on the website where you can figure out where to email us, send us a note at sales@towerdata.com. But thank you guys. I appreciate it. This was really helpful.
Thanks, everyone. Nice chatting today.
Have a good day, guys.
Take care.
Bye.